copy of the handout? Okay. All right. Today, we're going to be talking predominantly about sustainability and energy efficiency, that sort of thing. So, let's just sort of start off. One of the things you may or may not have heard about over the past several years is this idea about sustainability, okay? And, you know, it's been a buzzword for, you know, at least the past good 15, 20 years, but it's, you know, it's gained a lot of momentum over the past 10 or 15. And whenever you think about sustainability as it relates to real estate, what do you think about, if anything?
Well, something to give a consistent return.
Okay, maybe a consistent return. What else?
I think it has to do with growth management too, from a planning standpoint in a way.
Sure, in that context, absolutely. You know, what can a community sustain with respect to the amount of growth that's taking place within that community? Do they have the infrastructure to support it? You know, that sort of thing. So yeah, that's another aspect of it.
Yeah.
Okay, but in a lot of ways, sustainability, at least in the context of kind of looking at it from a financing point of view, has always been centered around how can we basically be more efficient, okay? In other words, how can we generate hopefully a better return and be more efficient with our resources? And so, and one of the big resources that we can potentially, I don't know whether control is the right word, or certainly try to take advantage of, is energy efficiency, okay? And what I mean by that is, what can we do to build into a project, a property, to make it more energy efficient, to consume less electricity, consume less water, produce less sort of solid waste, to produce less trash, to potentially encourage, you know, good behavior environmentally by the people that work there, you know, all those sorts of things. But the one that we tend to be able to kind of, I don't know, get our hands around and maybe be able to best understand is just simply energy efficiency, and predominantly focused on electricity consumption as well as water use. And so what I've done is put together a little spreadsheet. We'll kind of walk through sort of step by step and kind of give you a perspective, or you know, one way of maybe looking at this from both an investor's point of view as well as potentially a lender's point of view, as to kind of some of the different things that you might want to think about and kind of what maybe the flow-through effects are of some of these things on a property and its value and the rents it might be able to achieve and that sort of thing. So let's just start off with kind of one of the most basic questions that, at least in my mind, with respect to commercial real estate development as it relates to sort of energy efficiency and sort of sustainability. If you're a real estate developer, commercial real estate developer, and you're developing, let's say, shopping centers, apartments, office buildings, industrial properties, that sort of thing, in many instances, you've already been asked that question. What incentive do you have, if any, to create an energy efficient building as a developer? Okay, there might be some tax benefits, so absolutely. What else?
Saving money on utilities.
Okay, that's the one that initially, you know, we sort of throw out there, and obviously we're going to take that into consideration here, but aren't most commercial properties set up in a leasing structure where the tenant is the one responsible for the utilities, not the property owner? So one has to sort of ask the question, well, if the developer is not the one, or the owner or investor is not the one paying the utility bill, what real incentive do they have to make the building energy efficient?
Higher rent. a tenant attraction?
Yeah, attract the tenants.
Okay, how so?
Well, the expense would not be on them anymore, right? They'll have less expenses
It's
to
a
pay.
lower
to-
cost.
But how efficient,
That would be like-
and this is, I think, a very good argument, how efficient is the market in terms of disseminating that kind of information? I mean, you understand what I'm asking there? In other words, if I'm a tenant looking for space, how aware am I going to be about one property versus another with regard to how energy efficient it is?
Maybe the line of business that I'm in, it kind of, matches with that kind of energy efficient. Maybe I'm selling solar system, and that would be like a great kind of.
Okay, I understand that, but I guess what I'm asking is, if I'm a tenant, just any of you looking for space, okay, let's just say that most of you have probably looked for a house or you looked for an apartment, okay? Have you ever considered what your utility costs are prior to purchase or renting? Or have you just kind of just like, okay, well, it's probably just, normal, so I'm just gonna sign the lease or sign the documents?
You can't shop for it though.
What, I'm sorry?
You can't shop for FPL like power.
I understand. My point, though, is one of how aware is the space consumer of what the actual utility cost? Because part of your premise was, okay, well, you're going to pass along that savings to the tenant. But if the tenant is not aware that they're getting any savings, then how is that going to be useful? Is my point. Okay? So, getting back to my question, so what is really the incentive, if there is one, on the part of the developer to develop an energy efficient property?
Well, I think it depends on the certification. There's different certifications to achieve.
Absolutely, and the big ones, obviously LEED certification, so you've got LEED Silver, LEED Gold, LEED Platinum, all of which delineate.
I don't know what's the incentive in apartment buildings and residential, because people at the end, they want to buy cheap and nice homes. But I know in the industrial and commercial, the incentive is having a top tenant, because right now tenants, especially global or big national tenants, are looking to have their operations in an innovative technological space with efficient utilities,
Okay,
if you will.
okay.
So that's the incentive, to charge a premium rent.
Okay, you might be able to charge a premium rent, once again, for the tenant that understands it and gets it, but not all tenants are that way. Some tenants, once again, or many tenants, they're not paying attention to that sort of information up front. They may pay attention after the fact in a lot of cases, but in many cases up front, they really don't, necessarily pay attention to that. Especially if it's just like, once again, I'm talking about retail tenants in a strip center or a shopping mall, that sort of thing, that, that's not usually the first thing that pops into their mind is what the utility bill is going to be.
Well, what I was going to say is maybe you can expand on, you'll see from a developer's perspective that developers will develop to LEED standards, not necessarily LEED qualified. Does that make sense? I mean, they want to do it, but...
Well, they don't necessarily go through the certification process.
Okay.
Yeah, because the certification process is expensive.
Expensive, yeah.
But,
They
yeah, you're
still
right,
want
in many
build
cases, they will develop to the standard,
condition.
but I still don't feel like I'm getting 100% buy-in on the idea that a developer really truly has an incentive to make the property as energy efficient as possible and to try to minimize those costs of occupancy for their tenants.
Are there better lending terms?
Okay, so one of the things obviously we're going to explore are, is there a perception on the lender's point of view that if you have a really energy efficient building, is that going to potentially cause the building to be more highly occupied? Is it going to cause it to potentially have lower operating expenses? Therefore, you might be able to charge higher rents. You might be able to achieve a whole number of other objectives. And so, to what extent maybe is part of the burden of kind of this idea of whether or not a developer is going to be incentivized, is it going to be driven by the lender? And not necessarily just by the tenant. Okay? So, thing of trying to minimize utility costs, you know, to what extent, you know, is that maybe a significant enough piece of the overall cost structure to even matter? I mean, would you think there'd be any regional differences with regard to utility costs
Yeah.
Yeah.
across the country? I mean, just give me, you know, kind of an example.
Well, electricity cost is way more expensive here than if you go to Washington or Seattle, for example.
Yep. And why is that? Because there it's being produced by hydroelectric, which is, you know, extremely cost effective. Okay? And so they're going to have a lot less cost in the actual production of electricity than potentially we may have here. So that's one factor. But another factor is, you know, what are the differences in temperature, you know, from one part of the country to another? You know, is it going to be more expensive to heat a property or to cool a property? And, you know, and how, you know, much of a difference is that, and once again, you know, across the country. So, you know, those were regional differences are definitely going to exist. I mean, even, you know, on the water side of things, you know, to what extent do we have scarcity of water in certain parts of the country? And, you know, that drives up the cost of water consumption there, so they're going to be much more concerned about that there than they might be, you know, where there's more than adequate supply of fresh water. So, you know, there are definitely going to be those sort of regional differences that definitely factor into this. But I guess, you know, part of what I'm trying to get you to think about is, you know, this whole idea of, you know, creating energy efficient buildings, you know, whose responsibility is it? You know, is it the developer's responsibility? Is it potentially, you know, a lender's responsibility to try to, you know, impose that? Is it a tenant's responsibility? Or is it, you know, the government's responsibility? You know, you know, should the government intervene in all of this and say, you've got to adhere, you know, to a certain standard of efficiency in terms of, you know, electricity consumption per square foot or whatever it might be? Well, here's another question, okay, beyond, you know, those. So, to what extent, in your mind, should utility costs for every single property, including residential as well as commercial, be made public versus being kept private? Because in certain parts of the country, that information is public information. In other words, you can go and you can ask for any property that you would be interested in, what is the utility consumption for that property, and the utility company is required to disclose that information to you. Other parts of the country, that information is deemed to be private information and not easily accessible, you know, to the consumer. I mean, do you think it should be made public, or do you think it should be private? I mean, your perspective, you know, investors, developers, I mean, what do you think?
I mean, I think the older generation is a little bit more hesitant than the younger ones. Like, I think anyone that's...
In what way?
Well, I think, like, I'm a little older, I'm 40, for example. So for the past, like, 15 years, 20 years, I've been kind of in technology and cell phones and stuff, so I'm adapting. I still had a chance, but a lot of people who are 50 years old and the technology came, it's harder for them to kind of change their habits or understand new ways of doing things, so it's harder.
Okay, but that's not the question I guess I'm asking, or at least I don't think I am. I'm asking whether or not public utility information should be public or private.
It should be public. It should be private.
I think the more data you have, the better.
Okay.
Customers feel more confidence in purchasing. They have more information. They can calculate everything before they buy.
I mean, would there be an argument at all, though, from, you know, an owner's perspective to keep that information private?
Why though?
Of course. They're not an invasion of privacy in a way. I mean, especially if it's a single family home, I mean, you're paying for it, so it's really no one's business how much energy you're using.
Okay. Anybody else want to join in on that side?
They look at that way. Why would it make a difference though? Like if someone knows how much electrical bill you pay.
Well, maybe then there could be the whole issue of public shaming. That's saying, okay, you know, Ken over here is using so much electricity because he's got a swimming pool, he's got a hot tub, he's got, you know, all this other sort of stuff, you know, that he's running on electricity, and so his home is using so much electricity, we're gonna publicly shame him because he is potentially, you know, the high-end consumer of all of that utility.
I can see that happening.
You know, yeah.
I can see
Okay.
that happening.
And I'm not saying, just saying on a residential level, but on a
Generally, yeah, you're right.
you know, so there's that whole aspect.
I can see it happening.
Especially with, you know, really hardcore sort of environmentalists. And I'm not, once again, I'm not advocating one side or the other, okay? I'm simply saying these are some of the issues that we've got to begin to kind of think about and explore. Robert?
I think even with that information available, it's still difficult to get a pinpoint, like, I guess, estimate on, in like a, say an apartment building per unit, you'd have to know how many people live in the unit. So even though that number's available, it might not be accurate.
Sure.
Depending on.
Okay, no, there is a level of, yeah, accuracy that we want to try to nail down, but at least at a broader level, you know, the question is still, should that information be public or should it be private?
Which you can get estimates from FPL anyway without them disclosing private
Yeah.
information.
But once again, that's not necessarily the case across the country.
Okay.
You know, and that's, you know, sort of my point, that in certain parts of the country, all that information is as easily accessible as, like, for example, property tax records are. You know, for the most part across the country, pretty much universal, that property tax records are public information. And a lot of people would like for that to be private, you know, from the standpoint that, you know, don't necessarily like the idea that you can hop online right now and find out who the owner of a property is, how much they paid in property taxes, and what that, you know, property tax value is. The one thing that we still hold somewhat private are the actual sales transactions. I mean, while we do have an MLS that records, you know, the information for properties are on the MLS, if a property is not on the MLS, which many commercial properties are not, you know, we don't necessarily even know what some of those properties truly sold for. I mean, yeah, brokers talk, appraisers talk, that sort of thing, but, you know, in a lot of cases that information is not as solid as, you know, what we would maybe like for it to be. You know, so there's this whole issue of just kind of publicly available information, you know, as it relates to these sorts of things. But I don't want to get too far, you know, afield on this, other than to say that let's assume that all public utility data was public, okay? How would that then help to transform the market?
Maybe people would be more efficient knowing that others can see what they're doing.
Okay, I would agree with that. What else? That's the only reason?
Well, I mean, it'll help if you're looking to buy a property, you would know what the exact expenses
Okay,
for valuation purposes.
all right.
I
Anybody else?
think it's easier to find that data for residential than commercial, because in commercial, I mean, from my point of view, is the developers or property managers want to keep that information confidential.
But why? Why do they want to keep it confidential?
To get a better deal.
Okay,
Best
maybe to
deal
get a better
possible.
deal, or to control things possibly, or what if I am the owner of a property, commercial property, and
Because if tenants have access to that and, you know, they're deciding between two properties, let's say a commercial space, they're gonna choose the one that has less utility costs.
you would think, once again, if that information is easily available, you know, I mean, think about it like this. Imagine, I mean, almost all of you, I'm sure, have used Zillow or Realtor.com or, you know, one or more of the, you know, kind of, you know, information websites that's out there for, you know, properties, okay, for rent or for sale. But imagine, you know, kind of extending that a step further where you actually included utility costs, you know, in that sort of information, and to what extent, and I would tend to agree with Lewis, that if it was easily available and searchable and usable, you know, to what extent, you know, you might zero in on that as being one of the factors in your decision-making process. You know, I mean, those of you that have taken, you know, like the Geographic Information Systems class, I mean, imagine if you could literally go property by property and create almost like a heat map of you know, this property is extremely energy efficient, this one is not, you know, and be able to show that, you know, in a geographic representation where people potentially could then begin to make those kind of decisions as to, you know, choosing well, which one is going to be the most energy efficient versus which one is not. Does that make sense? Okay. Because I would argue, yeah, with more information, you know, it's probably, that goes a longer way to probably changing behavior. Because, you know, if I'm a property owner and I've owned a property for, you know, 20, 30 years and haven't done any substantive renovations to that property during that time period other than just the basic normal kind of wear and tear, but in terms of energy efficiency, I've done nothing. And my competitor, you know, across the street, you know, has a building that maybe has been completely retrofitted and completely upgraded with, you know, extremely energy efficient, you know, sort of features. You know, to what extent, you know, is that information going to, you know, do I want that information going out there as the owner of the kind of the ordinary or, you know, basic building versus that one that's extremely energy efficient? Because that's going to probably put them in an advantage relative to my property. Does that make sense?
Yeah. But if you have the better, like, the utility kind of cost on your side, you can use that to your advantage to ask more tenants, right? Be like, hey, listen, compared to other real estate
Sure.
around me, I can, since you're paying the CAM, you're paying less than the neighbor, so it might be helpful. You can do a reverse marketing.
Yeah, no, I think that it's interesting because I think in multi-tenanted buildings, it's maybe not as much the case that the prospective tenants are paying a lot of attention to this information, but certainly if they're going to be the sole occupant of the building, that, you know, it's a standalone building, you know, or it is one that, you know, as I said, an office building where they're the solo tenant, then I think there, you know, there is probably going to be a lot more attention, you know, paid to, you know, what that level of energy efficiency, you know, might be. But I mean, this has been an argument that's been going on for many years, you know, as to, you know, number one, you know, the whole issue of should the information be public or private. Number two, if it is public, to what extent that is going to impact in some way sort of the market dynamics of, you know, if I'm paying, you know, $10 less per square foot in utilities cost, should that be then reflected in some way in the rent that overall rent that I'm paying? You know, and, you know, to sort of make up for, you know, that difference. That if I'm the owner of a building and I've put in all these features and I've paid more to do so and made my building more efficient, should I not be able to potentially raise my rent substantially higher because my tenants are paying much lower utility bill?
Would that also cause for the banks to give you higher loan to value maybe?
That would be one of the other arguments, that yes, that a lender should feel more secure with a more efficient property because there's going to be
Less
well,
maintenance.
yeah, less maintenance, or more specifically, less expense.
Correct.
What about the argument, have you heard that real estate markets are inefficient as compared to the stock market?
Absolutely.
Because it's readily convertible to cash.
And that's one of the things that you know, over the almost 30 years I've been teaching, you know, the markets have become more efficient, but we're still, you know, quite a distance away from a lot of the information that you would need to make a completely informed and accurate decision, you know, about leasing, whether it's on a residential side or on a commercial side. That there's still so much variance in the amount of information that's out there that it makes it a real challenge.
Yeah, or the stock market readily available.
Absolutely.
The info, right.
The fluctuation is totally different too.
Okay, all right. So let's take a look at this little model. Hopefully, like I said, everybody's got the handout, and for some reason, this is not doing that.
Are there instances where maybe the property managers cover that cost and then just charge the tenants a flat rate?
In some cases, yes. Okay, there we go. All right. So let's take a look at the handout that I've got. We're going to kind of go through and change up some of the assumptions as we kind of work through this. So this is something that I put together a few years ago to kind of help to illustrate some of these differences and the way to maybe think about some of these differences. So let's sort of, start at the top, kind of work our way down. Okay, so the first one that we want to begin to sort of think about and potentially want to change is, are we necessarily going to have the same construction cost with an ordinary building versus an energy efficient one? No. So in this case, if we go up here, more than likely, yeah, we're going to have a higher cost of construction. Now, how much higher? That's going to depend on, obviously, how far we kind of go with this. One of the things that I want to spend a little bit of time for you to take a look at under LEED certification from the Green Building Council, basically these guys have come up with kind of a whole tiered sort of certification process where you can, the most basic thing is to be LEED certified, which is simply you've met some very fundamental sort of basic criteria, but then you kind of go up a notch to LEED Silver, which adds a few other layers of things that you're going to potentially include on your property, and then up to LEED Gold and then LEED Platinum. And the point being is the difference in construction cost between each of those levels can be fairly dramatic. The idea would be that at LEED Platinum, that you're pretty much maxing out everything you could possibly do to make the property as energy efficient as it could possibly be. Maybe almost to the point of where it's self-sustaining and almost generating all the power on site that it uses through sustainable measures, whether it's everything from the solar panels to basically recapturing water and reusing it on site and a whole number of other things. But the point being, from the construction cost perspective, let's say that the difference here maybe is $50 per square foot. All right, so we're going to give that highly energy efficient building a little bit of extra construction cost. All right, so in this case, representing a 25% difference between the two. All right, now the square footage of the building probably is not going to be any different. I mean, yeah, you potentially could make the argument, not saying that we should, but we could make the argument that with a highly efficient building, we might even consider making the workspaces that people have smaller so that we don't need as much space for them. And thinking about things like, for example, if we were thinking about this almost like as a corporate campus or a corporate facility, one of the things that over the years has kind of come and gone is the whole idea of what's called hot desking or office hoteling. Okay, which is where, historically, when we think about, office space, we think, okay, this person, they've got this, a wall here, cornering off, this is their space and their space only, and, in essence, everybody gets this walled off office, and then, kind of the idea, okay, well, now that we're going to break it down into cubicles, then we're going to make it into group workspace, we're going to do all these different things, but we may even go so far as to say many of our employees could work at home or they're going to work in the field and they don't really need a permanent desk, within the office environment, and we can save a lot of money, save a lot of space if we don't actually have to provide space to them. And one of the first examples of this was with auditing firms, accounting firms, where if anybody can squeeze out efficiencies, obviously accounting firms, kind of notorious for that. And so they were among the first to sort of say, all right, most of our auditors are going to be in the field, obviously, auditing clients, so they don't really need a permanent desk. So what we're going to do is we're going to provide literally a locker for them at the office with all their different sort of personal effects if they need it. And then whenever they come into the office, it'll be kind of almost like a first come, first serve, or maybe even, effectively reserving a space for them to be able to use. And if they are meeting with a client, we'll give them a nice, beautiful corner office to use that day. But the point is, all of that just sort of taken in tandem, what we're really saying is we might not need the same amount of space for the same number of employees, and if we can cut down the space per employee, that could be a huge cost savings to us. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, because think about, a normal sort of cubicle just within an office environment, that's maybe 8 foot by 8 foot. Okay, so that one person has, 8 feet of space by 8 feet of space, 64 square feet. Okay, we start doing the math on that. $64 square feet, and you know, if you're in a higher end office, I mean, that might be 40, 50 bucks a square foot per year. Let's just say 50 bucks a square foot. Why do none of these pins work? Okay, so 64 times 50, $3,200 per employee per year just for their portion of the office space. Does that make sense? Well, and chances are there are going to be hallways and other, you know, space that are going to be attributed to that. But the point being is that's not an insignificant number, okay? And so if you can cut that number down, especially if you've got several thousand employees, that could be a huge cost savings. Okay, so I don't want to minimize that in terms of the square footage. But we're going to go ahead and in our example here, maybe leave those the same. Okay, land acquisition cost, we're going to make the assumption that there's really no reason for those to be different unless you want to kind of make the argument, all right, once again, with a highly efficient building, we might not need as much land, therefore we can build on a smaller footprint, save ourselves some money, but once again, we're going to, for our example here, we're leaving them the same. All right? Then we move on down to the first piece of this that really begins to kind of get at the point of what Marielle was saying, is that a lot of times the government, at one level or another, intervenes into the real estate markets, okay? And this is where the government says we're trying to achieve some bigger, broader goal than the market itself will either allow to happen, or we want to expedite and push the market forward maybe more quickly than what it would maybe happen on its own. So can we offer up, as either a local government, state government, federal government, whatever, can we offer up some sort of an incentive, some sort of a rebate, some sort of a penalty, whatever it is, to potentially encourage folks to change not only their behavior, but more specifically, change maybe the design of their buildings, or to change the use of their buildings, or to change the energy efficiency of their buildings. I mean, what do you think about the whole idea of government intervention in that particular context? Good idea, bad idea, what? Okay, why?
I think it makes it more appealing for people to be engaged. And we all know there's an issue with using too much energy and.
But I mean, do you think that that's the government's role? It's an appropriate role for the government? Once again, I'm not advocating one direction or the other. I'm not trying to, once again, be conservative or liberal. That's not my point with that. I mean, do you think that that's the government's role to intervene in the market like that?
In this regard, yes, because it affects the whole country.
Yeah, it affects all.
It's different. It's like if it was like a personal or like maybe a small area, we'll say let the market decide for it. But this is like something that affects everyone and every citizen of the country. So yeah, why not?
How about looking at it from this perspective? Look at the way our government's structured, from federal to states are sovereign. I mean, how do you put something like that into effect and mandate it? Do you follow what I'm saying? Well,
Certainly at the local level, you know, one of the ways that you're able to achieve this is through local building codes. Okay. And in essence saying, we as a local city municipality, we're going to adopt a set of standards that holds all new construction to this minimum threshold that is substantially higher than everybody else. So automatically, it's going to be more expensive if you want to come develop in our city than the surrounding cities, which there's a whole other set of arguments that we want to talk about there. But you know, sort of left to its own devices, this local government is basically saying, we want to have super high quality development, super high energy efficiency, you know, with respect to the developments that take place in our city. And we know that that governmental interference or that governmental regulation being imposed is going to drive up the cost of development. Because pretty much, you know, one of the things I think that, you know, we as developers certainly understand is more regulation does drive up the cost of development. Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm saying that any sort of regulation drives up the cost of development. Because, I mean, think about it. Regardless of when we're talking about the energy efficiency sort of standards here with the local government, any type of regulation that you impose, what is one of the things that the local government then has to do as it relates to that regulation? They've got to monitor it.
Force it.
They've got to enforce it. Potentially, you know, impose penalties if you're not in compliance, okay? Or offer up incentives if they want to do the carrot versus the stick, you know? So inherently, more regulation is going to lead to a higher cost. But now the question is, does it really, you know, lead to a higher quality? You know, because part of what we're really trying to achieve, if we're, you know, this local government is, you know, the quest toward quality. You know, just putting in higher standards, you know, by itself, you know, does that automatically, you know, lead to overall higher quality of development within a particular city? You know, because what I guess I'm trying to sort of get at with this is that you could have, as I was describing earlier, you know, a situation of, okay, here is city X that has really high standards, but yet surrounding city X are other municipalities that have maybe really low standards. So if low standards is equal to low cost, so low standards equal low cost, you know, are you going to have a lot of developers and a lot of potential purchasers of property being driven away from the higher cost and the higher standards to the lower cost, lower standards? And maybe in the short term, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but in the long term, are you going to end up with really bad development that occurs, you know, in these areas because there wasn't enough of a regulatory standard put into place? That after a few years, the properties are going to be in severe disrepair, they're going to be grossly energy inefficient, you know, a whole number of other things, whereas by this particular local government sort of setting the bar really high, you know, is it going to be able to maintain and sustain a really high level of quality and value over time? And this is a constant struggle. I mean, there's no absolute answer to this, other than if you look around, you can probably see variations from one city to another, you know, here in South Florida, as to, you know, which ones have the highest standards for even like requiring landscaping. You know, that probably there are certain local governments that are going to have, you know, the gold standard for, you know, landscaping requirements, whereas others not so much. Or as it relates to energy efficiency, same sort of thing.
Isn't that what China's doing right now?
In what way?
Solar power energy, power generators, just reusable energy that you're using for.
Yeah, but how much of that is being done, interestingly enough, out of necessity? You know, because this also gets into a whole other argument of, are we doing this because we think it's the right thing to do, or are we doing this because we have to do this? You know, and in some cases, you know, I would argue, especially like with China, that they really, to a certain extent, don't have a choice, because with the amount of growth that they've had, and with the population density that they have, and with the pollution that they have, they've got to be able to find a more sustainable, you know, way of producing and using, you know, all forms of electricity. Not to say that we don't, but we don't tend to have the same level of population density that they do, at least across the country. All right. So, okay. But anyway, governmental rebates for energy and sustainability. So, you know, this would be the kind of thing that a local government, state government, federal government would step in and say, all right, we're going to incentivize you with this highly energy efficient property, that if you know, meet certain standards, we're going to give you either a property tax rebate, we're going to give you potentially cash money, or we're going to give you, you know, something else that will be a government grant, whatever it might be, but in this case, $500,000 difference. Okay, does that make sense? Now, what do you think about the whole thing of, you know, with respect to sort of government getting involved, of the carrot versus the stick. I mean, the carrot is you give them an incentive to do something. The stick is you beat them into submission with respect to, you know, forcing them to do something. And if they don't do it, you're going to impose a massive penalty for not doing it. I mean, so, any thoughts on that?
Well, I participated in a LEED certified building, office building in city of Miramar. And it's funny because when we submitted the plans and we were getting ready to get the building permits, the planning and zoning manager said, hey, now we're imposing office buildings and office developments in this area to be at least silver certified. So we couldn't do anything. We didn't even have the chance to negotiate. So we had to go back to the consultants, the architect, civil engineer, and, you know, have the plans updated for a LEED certified building. And, you know, that wasted time, wasted a little bit of money. And right now the property's built, it's doing really well, but you know, there wasn't a structure, a guideline from the city standpoint, you know.
It wasn't a true partnership. It was more of once again, this is
Yeah.
what we're doing, and we're imposing it upon you.
Yeah. So the only penalty they told us to have if we didn't comply with that was to not let us have the CO at the end
Okay,
of the construction.
gotcha.
That was the only
There come a
penalty.
point though where you just price people completely out of the market.
And that's another, you know, aspect of this is, you know, through this, you know,
Realistically.
sort of regulation, you know, do you get to a point of, if you start requiring too much as a local government, you know, do you do just that? You
People
price
don't
people
live
out of the market in the
anymore.
sense that they're not able to develop there because it's just too expensive and people aren't willing to maybe pay for, you know, that particular higher level
Or
of
they don't have the income.
quality or standard.
No.
Okay. Okay, so moving on. So we get that $500,000 that we put in there. Okay, so we kind of come down and we look at this, and just to sort of take this particular number here for a second. So with our two different properties, we've got the one on the left, the ordinary building, the one on the right, obviously the energy efficient building, and, you know, we've got two basically differences between the two. One is the construction cost per square foot that we put in, and then this governmental rebate. And so with those two things, basically the combined effect is we end up with the more energy efficient one costing us roughly, yeah, actually should be negative 500,000. Right, hit the button there. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so the net effect is a 22% discount, or not discount, difference between basically the energy efficient one, so it's more expensive for the energy efficient than it obviously is for the ordinary building. Okay, that should not be a big surprise. Okay, now this next part is the part that a couple of you kind of had looked at and you began to make your own assumptions, which I'm glad you did. And that relates to specifically how a lender may look at one versus the other. All right? And so in this particular example, I just simply made the assumption that a lender's going to look at this and would they potentially say, all right, with the ordinary building, we're going to give you a 70% loan to value ratio, but because it's an energy efficient building, we're actually going to give you a higher loan to value ratio. And once again, the thought process there being that if I'm the lender, I'm going to look at this property and I'm going to say, all right, it's going to be more energy efficient, therefore it's going to have lower operating costs, therefore it has lower risk, therefore I'm going to potentially loan a higher percentage on the energy efficient building. Okay, what do you think about that? Is that a legitimate argument or not?
Less risk.
Okay.
The building will last longer and.
Yeah, you might also make that argument too, that there could be, you know, some features associated with it, that the durability of the building could be, you know, one to take into consideration. Okay? The long term, we're not gonna probably have any real difference there. They're probably both gonna be the same long term. But the interest rate. So once again, kind of, as we talked about the loan to value ratio, you have the same kind of impact with the interest rate on the loan. Saying the more energy efficient building, we're potentially going to give you a lower interest rate on that building than on the ordinary building to make it a little bit more competitive from a lending point of view, okay? All right, so all of that kind of combined together, then what impact does that have in terms of the equity being required on this deal? And this model, what it's basically doing, much like the other models that we've done in terms of like the front door, back door analysis, and this is kind of a variation of that to a certain extent, is it's basically kind of backing into these numbers as to what would be the equity required for one versus the other. So what we're saying is that with this, the more energy efficient building, you're going to have a lower equity requirement, meaning less money that you're going to have to put in up front as the owner developer. So that's a good thing, okay? And then the overall debt amount is going to be higher, but once again, you're putting in less equity, okay? Does that make sense? Then we kind of come down here to more some of the property performance sorts of things. And you're going to play around with this model a little bit to kind of make sure that you're comparing completely apples to apples. But in this particular case, we've got a before-tax cash flow for the ordinary building that's substantially higher, but there may be reasons for that, and we're going to kind of get into that a little bit later. But right now, yeah, you sort of see a big difference there. The annual debt service, obviously, is much higher for the energy efficient, but the debt service coverage ratio. Here, much like the loan to value ratio, we're saying as the lender, we feel really comfortable with the energy efficient building. We're willing to go as low as a 1.1 debt coverage ratio. It's really low, and that's how much we believe in this whole concept of energy efficiency and the low cost relative to the ordinary building, let's say 1.4, okay? Make sense? All right. Then operating expenses. We're saying obviously ordinary building, maybe 35% operating expenses as a percentage of effective gross income, whereas with the energy efficient one, we're saying maybe 15%, okay? So a pretty substantial difference between the two, all right? I'm not saying these are accurate numbers. I'm saying the model will allow you to obviously change it and adapt to it, okay? And then this one gets down to Marielle's point earlier about the occupancy level. One of the things that has been shown over and over again to actually give some credibility to the idea that people are paying attention to this is that what researchers have found over the past several years is that tenants are paying attention to these occupancy costs and the whole package of costs affiliated with operating expenses and utility bills and that sort of thing. And so you do see a higher occupancy level for those properties that are more energy efficient than you do for the other ones that are not, okay? So there definitely is some credibility there to that argument. Now, we kind of flow on down through this, and one of the things that then you begin to sort of see, and then it kind of makes you begin to sort of wonder, well, what's really going on here? We're saying, okay, the required net rental rate per square foot is $21.97 versus $21.30, so not much of a difference. And you're actually getting a higher rate of return as an equity investor of 10.07 for the ordinary building versus the energy efficient one. Now, I kind of purposely sort of set it up this way to sort of get you now to think about what is potentially driving some of those variables, okay? And in terms of, which ones, are we really looking at an apples to apples comparison? Are there things that are potentially, driving those sort of bottom line numbers, okay? And so I want you to spend a little bit of time kind of thinking about that and kind of pointing out some things that we might want to do to kind of bring it more in alignment with what you might think reality would be. Question?
Well, I was just gonna say that the debt coverage ratio is
Right.
forcing the NOI down
Right.
on the model.
And also the operating expenses are way lower than a conventional building.
So let's just say that we put this at 1.4. Interesting. So just by changing just that one variable, the debt service coverage ratio, look at how much of a flow-through effect that's had. Okay? It drove up our overall rate of return on our equity dramatically, but it also did something else. It drove up our required net rental rate per square foot. Okay? But see, here's the thing. You've got to really, with this model, what you've really got to do is isolate almost each individual variable to see what the impact is. Okay? What I mean by that is that if we sort of, just start all the way almost back up at the top here for a second, and we make everything identical. This is sort of start, I'm just going to, just to prove the point. Okay, so now everything is identical on both sides, so all the numbers match up completely, on purpose, okay? So if we start to change just a few little things, just to see what the impact would be, all right? So for example, if we change the vacancy and collection loss, and so instead of it being 15, we go down to 10, all right? Interestingly enough, that doesn't have any impact, or at least the way the model is set up, doesn't have any impact on our return at all. What it has an impact on, though, is what our potential gross income on the property is going to be for one versus the other. Okay? So our required PGI. Okay? Because what it's basically saying is with a lower sort of vacancy rate, higher occupancy, what it means is we don't have to generate as much money. Okay? All right? So let's take another one. Step back. Let's look at the operating expenses. So we say we go down to, once again, let's say 15%. So with that, once again, same sort of thing. It just backs into a potential gross income number that is lower. But once again, it impacts the required gross rental rate, but doesn't impact the net rental rate because, once again, we're dealing with the operating expenses. Okay, now the debt service coverage ratio, let's say we make that 1.1. Okay, now that really begins to flow through all the way down in terms of impacting the actual return, but it doesn't necessarily have the positive impact that we think it would. But what it's doing, if you look, it's radically adjusting the before tax cash flow requirement, okay? Which, begins to make you wonder, are we really looking at sort of an apples to apples comparison, all right? So you got to make sure that you're looking at what that before tax cash flow is, because that's what's being driven by that debt service coverage ratio change.
Could you give a little bit of the logic behind it?
Well, it's a question of how the model is set up in terms of the order of the information that's being processed, okay? And so it's a question of, in this particular case, what I'm doing is, basically, working from, okay, the above, which is basically taking the debt that we've got and then working backwards from that and applying a debt service coverage ratio to be able to then determine what my annual debt service is going to be and what my before tax cash flow is going to be. But we could have worked it, obviously, basically just the opposite of that. In other words, it's the same sort of thing of like we did the simple financial feasibility analysis model. You can either do the back door approach or you can do the front door approach. It's just a question of which direction are you sort of approaching it from.
And just
so,
kind of confused with why would that drive like the return down?
Well, okay, we'll take a look at the formulas. But that's my point is that you've got you gotta sort of tear apart the model and try to understand specifically what is being done. I mean, the logic is sound, it's just a question of whether or not, you know, it's looking at it from the top down or from the bottom up. Okay, and then as we look at the loan to value ratio, here, once again, if we can get a higher loan to value ratio, that is going to influence our rate of return, but also it has a flow through effect on these other variables. Okay, and the same sort of thing with a lower interest rate. My point that I want you to do is I want you to spend a little bit of time sort of playing with this in small groups and kind of talking about kind of some of these assumptions and some of the calculations. And then I want you to think about, well, is there another way that you might set it up? Okay, a different approach.
To compare both, you mean?
Yeah. All right, so break into small little groups of two, no more than 3 to a group, and sort of play around with the model a little bit. Talk about specifically the impact of the different variables. Think about if there are other variables that you might want to include, okay, that we're not including here.
So these numbers are which ones? So yeah.
That means one income is going to be less is going to okay. Your PBI so if you get this, it might not show you on the ROI, but it will show you you're saving 1.2 million instead of showing you an ROI, it gives you an actual cash flow back. You got more money to work with, so you won't be able to return the number here. Look, I mean, that's what it's trying to do. See the expenses of the existence of the store operator was not the way it wants. Of course.
I was having a number that's earlier, police standards for like what was
So look, I just did this. I just tempted
based on
yeah. So like It makes sense. This shoots down. So if you didn't have that.
I see where it's coming from. Just completely.
No. Interest rates weren't the same.
So I'm thinking, if we work backwards, I start with like a wonder so it's up now.
What's that?
You can't pay for the expenses, so it's just, there are any expenses that you have right now, because solar lives, consumption. In the real world, self-sufficient, later on, like in the next 5 to 10 years, governments are going to require the banks for everything, working stuff that is mandatory. They're going to do that, and we'll do the same thing here. Energy savings, you want water.
Is that the bank? Yes. Just hit the equal share. Like our shares that this really. What's it called? I'm sorry.
Okay, So I asked you guys to sort of take a look at the model, play around with it a little bit, kind of come up with your sort of your own set of questions, but also to kind of see what you might do to modify it or expand it, that sort of thing. So let's start with that. All right, so what kind of things did you run across? Okay.
I mean, if you were to find or change it to where the required minimum, see that the problem is it's the required minimum net operating income. So when you change the debt coverage ratio,
Yep.
it drives that down to the minimum.
Yep.
So you kind of have to separate the NOI from the debt coverage ratio
Okay.
to get a better idea.
I would not disagree with you. Okay. All right. What else?
May I ask how he came to that conclusion? How did he come to that conclusion?
When you change it to the 1.1, for example, it drives the NOI down to what the minimum requirements for the lender.
And BTSF.
Correct.
3.8, it was in 10.
So technically, 1.1 should be more attractive,
Right.
but it's
Yeah.
actually driving it down lower, so
And
it's
that's
like,
what Jarvis was arguing.
Yeah, it's like-
So realistically, it's not going to be, that's the bare minimum you need to make to cover the debt.
Right.
All right, so we may want to modify the model that way. Okay, what else? Yep.
I mean, maybe because I'm a broker, I look at it in the opposite direction, where you start with what you think you can achieve.
Okay.
The rent from the tenant.
Yep.
Based either on a tenant you have in your back pocket, or just market intel, whatever. So I worked it backwards and to the point where the debt service coverage ratio won't affect your return because you're still achieving your market rent.
Yep.
And theoretically, you can get more rent out of a tenant that wants to be in a LEED building.
Yep.
Versus non-LEED.
Right. So, I mean, and so all you're really doing, once again, it's what I was saying earlier. It's like, are you approaching this like a front door analysis or a back door analysis? You know, and which direction are you coming at it from? All right. And so in this particular case, we're coming at it from the top of saying, okay, here are our construction costs. Tell us what the rent is that we need to get. Whereas Dustin is saying, okay, let's go the other direction, once again, much like we do with front door, back door analysis, and say, let's start with the rent and work basically from there to figuring out how much we could potentially spend on this and ultimately what's the rate of return we could get. Okay, so that's an easy modification of the model. It's just going, once again, kind of the opposite direction. Okay, Louis?
I think in terms of the LTV, it should be the same, because if you are not a consistent developer that does LEED certified buildings, a bank's gonna see you as you're gonna develop just another conventional building.
Okay.
He's not gonna care much about the performance because you don't actually have existing properties already, you know, making less expenses.
Okay.
And in terms of interest rate, I think it's gonna be pretty much the same. I don't think it's gonna go down 200 basis points, but it's just an assumption.
Okay. No. Once again, I never have said that I would argue that these specific numbers are accurate in terms of the difference between them.
Okay.
Okay. So it was meant to be just sort of an illustrative model of what potentially could happen. We're getting to where you're talking about here in just a minute.
Isn't it typically the inverse, I guess? So a higher LTV usually has a higher interest rate, or no?
Well, as a general rule, yes, because the idea is the higher risk for the lender.
Right.
But once again, we're saying here that potentially that maybe that risk is being mitigated because you have lower operating expenses.
Right. So having both the best worlds there
Right.
really helps you.
Okay, any other insights about the model itself and playing around with it? Good or bad? Okay, so here's what I want you to do. I want each of you within your little small group of two or whoever you're working with, I want you to look at these 6 issues, okay? And these are Googleable things, okay? You figure out what kind of Google search you're going to go through. First of all, I want you to go through and take a look at the LEED standards required by local governments, okay? And specifically investigate to what extent local governments are, as Louis was saying, not necessarily here in Florida, but across the country, are setting standards and saying all buildings must meet a LEED silver or LEED gold or whatever it may be, and kind of see what sort of reaction has happened by the local developers within those communities. The second one is I want you to look for the issue that Marielle brought up, which was, what are the differences in occupancy levels for energy efficient buildings? Okay, once again, another Googleable sort of thing. All right. The third one, look for differences in energy consumption by LEED or Energy Star. Energy Star is another sort of rating that a property can get, but look for what is maybe the difference in energy consumption. You know, by the different LEED certification levels or Energy Star certification levels, and you know how much of a difference that really is going to make. Fourth one, to get to one of your points, I don't know which, you know who made the point, but basically, what are the actual, what is the actual difference in terms of the lending standards for energy efficiency? In other words, look up, see for a variety of lenders, do they actually have a policy for energy efficient buildings? And one of the ones to take a look at is Green Bank. Okay. All right. Number 5, look at the construction cost for energy efficiency. All right. Try to actually isolate that and see what are the actual construction costs as you maybe migrate from one sort of energy consumption level to another. And then finally, what are some of the different governmental incentives that are out there for energy efficiency? Okay, so once again, in your small groups, look for all 6 of those. We're going to give you, let's say, 30 minutes. And then each little group is going to make a report. And don't necessarily Google precisely the words I've got up there. Try to see, you may have to obviously, be a little bit creative in terms of coming up with the right words to use. And once again, the idea behind each one of these is to find some actual examples. One of the websites you might want to take a look at is for the Institute of Market Transformation, imt.org. imt.org, Institute of Market Transformation.
Yeah, I have some stuff that concrete. Exactly. I think April. Well, like you said, you need someone to impose it, someone to follow it up, jobs with it, someone that's.
Okay, give me another 5 minutes or so. Are you making good progress on the list? Yes? Okay. Okay.
Yeah, that's what it is. That's how we set this. I guess kind of great. Things that we can say, what have pollution, for example, this is the way we should also test to see if the AC this or the utility power, they have left restrictions. For
Yeah, you see it. That's the third party that covers to make sure that all the systems are enforced. When it's sort of to keep the certification going, I guess how do we know for the Nicole has to make sure.
If you maintain certification.
Can we get a 1098?
Whoa,
1098?
one more time?
1098?
What about it?
When do we get it? They send it to us in the mail, do you know? Oh, you don't know what 1098 is? No.
Tax form, right?
Yeah, it's like when you pay for school, like cash, government rebates you something back. Because the university usually sends you that and then you send your taxes.
Hey, Cash, I do,
January? I didn't know what.
I do that too. You gotta go to the administration and ask for that.
Okay. Start this in a couple seconds.
So you're at home this thing ahead. That's crazy.
Okay, let's go ahead and get started on this first one. All right, so the LEED standards required by local governments. What I want you to do is to obviously find at least one or more examples of local governments that have imposed LEED certification standards on either new construction, renovations, you know, maybe by different property type, that sort of thing. So what did you find?
For the first one, we kind of like, I mean, from what we did, we looked at different, there was not really actual, like a lot of local governments that actually implement a certain rule.
Yes, they are. There absolutely are.
Do you mean like in terms of like?
They were with absolute set requirements of saying that all new buildings or renovations
Yeah, I
must
found
be
one
of a
like
certain
that.
standard, okay?
I found a website that tells you all the municipalities and counties in Florida that not require, they have LEED certified options, and they tell you all the standards you have to follow.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's USGBC Florida website.
Okay, so we got conflicting information from those two teams, all right? Who else on the first issue?
We found a website, but it had all the states, so, well, different major cities in different states. So, like for example, on here, if we look at, I'm just trying to pick one that's not super long. Like San Francisco, it says here that commercial buildings between 5,000 and 25,000 square feet have to complete a LEED checklist. Newly constructed and renovated commercial buildings over 25,000 square feet must be LEED Gold certified.
Okay, So in other words, all I really want you to do is to find at least one or more examples of where a local government has put into place some sort of a requirement for a certain level of certification. Robert?
Well, we found that Phoenix was an example of one that
Okay, what do they require?
all new municipality buildings built with 2006 bond funds to be LEED certified.
Okay, so that's an example of a local government requiring it. Well, the federal government, this was several years ago, the General Services Administration, which is the main governmental sort of property manager for the federal government. Now, this includes virtually all federal buildings are managed by the GSA. Well, you read the headline, they require now LEED Gold for all new buildings and major renovations. Now, one of the reasons that they did this was obviously not only to show that they were being progressive, it really wasn't so much that. Here's the thing, this is one of the lessons about this whole kind of energy efficiency, LEED certification thing that we really didn't talk about, and that is the following. For governments and for nonprofits, think about this for a second. It is extremely easy to get upfront money to build a building if you are a nonprofit or a governmental entity. What is more difficult is getting money that sustains the building in terms of operating costs, okay? Think about it like this. You potentially, have some sort of affiliation with a nonprofit. Could be a church, could be a school, could be a hospital, could be, a whole variety of uses, or for that matter, once again, a government facility. It's going to be really easy for you to go to your constituents and say, okay, we want to raise a lot of money to build this new building, and we want to make it obviously energy efficient, so you can kind of sell people on that. And that is a sort of campaign, if you will, that can get people excited. What doesn't get people excited, if you think about fundraising things, is to say, we need constantly, every year, more money to pay our electric bill, or more money to pay our, landscaping bill, or more money to do with this. So if you can spend, my argument with this is, if you can spend more money up front as a governmental entity or as a nonprofit and get a highly, highly, highly energy efficient building, that's probably going to work to your advantage simply because you're going to have more difficulty in getting the operating cost ongoing basis. Does that make sense? Okay, so there is a method to the madness as it relates to this. Okay, whereas the individual sort of average ordinary kind of occupant or tenant of a building, it's maybe a little bit more of a challenge for them to say, yeah, we're willing to spend all that extra money up front to get those cost savings for several years into the future, because with them, they're really looking for a very quick payback. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so there's definitely a conflict there. Okay, so like I said, that was the sort of the LEED certification with regard to kind of federal buildings. Another example that I found was in Canada. Vancouver was one of the first cities within North America to require LEED Gold certification on a lot of their office buildings. So, it's one of those sorts of things. Do we, as local governments or federal government, by requiring these kind of higher standards, is that a way, really to, help drive down energy consumption? And is there a method to our madness with that? Well, here's another angle we haven't talked about. Who provides electricity? In many cases, it is a local government or some sort of a quasi-governmental entity, okay? Well, whoever it may be. And once again, it varies from across the country or across, the world for that matter. In some cases, it actually is a governmental entity. In other cases, it's a quasi-governmental entity. In other cases, it's a private sector supplier. But my point with that is that one of the things that people don't fully understand as it relates to power generation or as it relates to water treatment plants is that as a general rule, if you need extra capacity, it's not simply as simple as adding another little generator to produce more power. In most instances, it's a massive incremental step that you have to take as that power provider to provide that excess capacity, okay? In terms of building a massive coal-powered, electric generating plant or a water treatment facility or whatever it may be. And so it comes in very big chunks, okay? So if you think about that for a second, especially if you're a local government providing power, would you rather simply say, all right, let's see if we can cut the consumption down as a whole and not have to build another plant to basically satiate whatever demand is being sort of created? Does that make sense? In other words, should we maybe offer up incentives to sort of say, instead of having to build that extra power plant, or instead of having to build that extra water treatment facility, can we change the behavior on the part of our customers to lower the demand so that we don't actually have to generate that extra capacity? Does that make sense? Okay? Because most utility providers are not profit-seeking enterprises. Okay? And in order to get funds to build the new power plants or whatever it might be, usually that means they're going to have to go to the taxpayers to do that. Okay?
May I ask why is it still like 4 states in the U.S. that are banned LEED certification for all their buildings? Like there's 4 states that ban LEED. Yeah, Alabama, Georgia, Missouri, and Maine.
Diplomatically, my assumption is you have politicians within those states that for whatever reason have chosen to take a stance on those particular issues. And it's probably just that. It's politically driven. And what you may have in certain instances, like for example, there are certain cities that have come up with their own standards, like Austin, Texas. If you look at Austin, Texas, they don't use LEED, but they have their own set of standards that they have developed in-house that they feel achieve the goals that they want to achieve as opposed to relying on the standards that are set up by LEED. So it's not necessarily that LEED is the one all-encompassing thing. It's just that it's a kind of it's an industry standard. But not everybody has to use that same standard, but at least it gives some sort of
because it's globally recognized, that's
right. That's really all it boils down to.
Yeah.
Is that and people that are in the development industry, whenever they're talking to other folks, they can talk the same language because they're all talking about the same set of standards. But if you go into an area that has their own separate standards, then it's a very different kind of dialogue, and then you're going to have architects and contractors that are going to have to be familiar with what those local standards are. Okay. All right. Any other examples on this item number 1 up here?
I see DC that all schools have to be LEED gold.
Okay.
That's an example.
And once again, another sort of makes my point that I was talking about earlier, that it's much easier for a school district to start to say, let's do a bond issue to build a nice new energy efficient school than to have to go to taxpayers every single year and say, we need more money to operate that facility.
Yeah.
Okay? All right, good. Okay. I'm counting on Marielle to give you the answer for the second one.
I looked.
So, differences in occupancies for energy efficient buildings. Who found something?
I got 16 to 18% higher than non-rated buildings.
Okay, and where did you find that?
The U.S. Department of Energy.
Okay.
They did a PDF on, what was it? The energy efficiency and financial performance. So,
Okay, that sounds very relevant to us. Okay, Paul, what'd you find?
Well, kind of going back to what you stated at the beginning of the lecture was kind of the scarcity of public info. So the majority of info out there has been done on surveys of owners of LEED certified buildings and buildings with energy efficiency in them, is how they've gotten the information.
Okay.
It's not so public, so it's kind of hard to nail down an exact number, if that makes sense.
Okay, anybody else? Take a look. Let's see. Journal of Sustainable Real Estate.
That's a PDF file, right?
Well, it's a journal.
Okay, I found the PDF.
What? Okay, so this is sort of a practitioner / academic journal that's been around for a few years, called the Journal of Sustainable Real Estate, and specifically in terms of, It's not a dangerous site, come on.
Yeah,
It does not like that site for some reason. Okay, well, let's see if we can do a search.
Why don't you type PDF at the end of your search? Sometimes it, gives you
Well,
the,
okay.
the actual journal, you're
The
looking for.
point being is that particular journal has at least 2 or 3 different articles specifically addressing the issue of occupancy levels. Let's just try it this way. Okay, here we go. An investigation of the effect of eco-labeling. So this is one aspect of this in terms of occupancy level. And so this is just one article of several, but here they're basically controlling for differences in age, height, building class. The results suggest that occupancy rates are approximately 8% higher in LEED labeled offices and 3% higher in Energy Star labeled buildings. So the point being is there are different types of research that are out there specifically looking at these kind of issues. This just happens to be one focused, as they're calling it eco-labeling. So if you call your building in the marketing materials, basically we're saying we have an energy efficient building and we are promoting that part of that, just that labeling process could have an effect on your, excuse me, on your occupancy rates. Okay, make sense? So let's just see, there was another one that it pulled up just as another kind of example of this. How risky are sustainable real estate projects and evaluation of LEED and Energy Star development options? So let's see what their conclusions are here. So basically, we've got in this case, we're just looking at the incremental construction cost in terms of the rate of return that you're getting from those incremental construction costs. So basically what they're saying is with the additional cost of construction that associated with achieving that certification, that incremental cost of construction relative to the return that that incremental cost of construction has, you're getting a really high return on that. Okay, not the overall return. The overall return is going to be higher. But what they're looking at is the incremental return. So in other words, here's my point. if you're spending an extra dollar per square foot on construction, what they're saying is that potentially you're getting 126, or basically an extra $1.26 return on every dollar that you're spending, okay? You're getting all your money back and an additional 26% on top of that, okay? So that's just another example, okay? See what else is up here. Energy efficiency in separate tenant spaces, okay, feasibility study, okay, that's not specifically what we're looking at. Okay, here's something by CoStar. Okay, so another example of a CoStar study finds Energy Star LEED buildings outperform their peers. So once again, they're looking at trying to strengthen the business case, and so what do they got? So LEED buildings command rent premiums of $11.33 per square foot over their non-LEED peers and have a 4.1% higher occupancy. So once again, more evidence sort of showing what we're sort of talking about, okay? Like I said, you can find a lot of this stuff on your own too. Okay, so those are a couple of examples of basically the differences in occupancy for energy efficiency, okay? So what about this one? Difference in energy consumption by LEED or Energy Star standards, okay? Anybody find any good stuff on this?
Yeah, I found that the Energy Star standards focuses solely on energy reduction and CO emission reduction. So there are more buildings that save in energy by having the energy standard than the LEED, because LEED has 7 different categories.
Yes. Okay.
And we only can focus on a few, not all.
Yeah, so that's the thing I should have mentioned earlier. The LEED standards cover a whole cross-section of factors beyond just energy consumption, okay, and energy efficiency. Whereas Energy Star focuses almost exclusively on just that one piece, on the actual energy efficiency piece, okay? All right, but, okay, so in terms of the differences between the consumption, anything?
18%, I think, is the number I saw.
Right, I think I got one here.
It's like 13% lower. Usage or
Yeah, so this one talks a little bit about yeah. Okay, so demonstrating energy efficient by designing to exceed energy code or achieving Energy Star benchmark in the top 30% of buildings. It still doesn't get specifically to what I was asking, which is what can we expect with these different levels of performance? Okay, that one doesn't get at it. What I'm looking for here is to try to see if we can find something that actually gets to basically saying, okay, for LEED certified buildings, we would expect this level of energy consumption per square foot. For LEED silver, we'd expect this level of consumption. LEED gold, LEED platinum, okay? Or some other sort of rating system to basically show, you know, what you would expect in terms of operating cost differences for one standard versus the other. Yep.
It says that the electricity and the gas expenses in Energy Star buildings are more than 13% lower than compared to non-rated buildings.
Okay. All right. Well, there's something for us. Okay. Anybody else?
That's LEED, right?
Yeah.
Energy Star. No one else found anything?
Yeah, I found that Energy Star buildings consume about 30% less energy than conventional buildings.
Okay.
But 35% is not.
Okay. All right. Let's move on then. Okay, lending standards for energy efficiency buildings, or energy efficient buildings. So one of the articles from the Institute of Market Transformation was financing energy efficiency through mortgage loans, okay? And so this is a great little, it's like 4 or 5 pages long, but you know, it's a good little primer clearly on just kind of understanding, and it's brand new, it was just published this year. But like, you know, some of the things that we were just talking about, you know, a reduced default risk, higher loan proceeds are 2 of the multiple opportunities when lenders, you know, take energy efficiency into consideration. Go through and then talk about all the different sorts of things that can be done in terms of just examples of things that can reduce costs in terms of changing out the lighting, changing out different types of insulation, a whole number of other things, okay? And how that will result, obviously, in cost savings. Oops.
Professor, can you go up a little bit, please? On the bottom it says replace inefficient heating plant with mechanical.
Yeah, so they basically did 2 different case studies for 2 different buildings, sort of side by side, kind of like us. And they simply said what could be done to in essence,
to save that money back.
right.
You
And
save
so
this much money.
And so ultimately what they did, these 2 different buildings, they did just kind of a simple payback analysis and saying, okay, with all these different, you know, things, what would be the investments, what would be the annual cost savings, what would be the payback period? Okay, just giving examples. But more specifically, a little bit later in this, which I thought was obviously the part that I relate to, is numbers with regard to NOI. But you know, saying that on a property, if you've got a historical NOI of 132,000, but your adjusted NOI with the energy savings kicks it up to 151,000, you know, what does that mean in terms of additional available loan proceeds that are going to be available to you on your property, okay? That in essence, as you increase your NOI, that means that potentially you can borrow more money, okay, to help pay for those things that you maybe put into place, and then potentially have a little bit of extra money left over in some cases.
A lot of times governments also subsidize programs like this to try to improve.
Precisely.
People, yeah.
Yep, yeah.
Well, that's, I found on the Fannie Mae website, they have lower interest loans, and then they do it based on the certification of like 20 different certifications, I guess.
Okay.
Energy Star and a bunch of others. So that's, you know. That's
So the point is, it exists.
Right.
I'm not just saying a bunch of random stuff that obviously has no basis in reality. Okay, so it exists. All right. Anything else that you guys found on the lending standard stuff?
Yeah, he found the same, he found in fact in Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, but I only see it for multifamily, not for single family homes or
Okay.
condominiums.
Okay. All right, moving on. What about the actual construction costs themselves for energy efficiency in terms of cost per square foot? Yep.
The only thing, I found a single family home, and it said it was on average 5 to 10% more.
Okay.
That was for residential.
Okay. Anybody else found any other sort of? Yep.
So for commercial, they had $1.80 per square foot for the buildings that saved at least 50% of heating and energy system of buildings that meet, I don't know what it is, it's ASHRAE.
ASHRAE?
Yeah, ASHRAE standards. So,
Okay.
and then also they had another deduction of 60 cents per square foot for measures affecting building envelope, lighting, or heating and cooling.
Okay.
Those type of things.
Okay. Anybody else find anything on that one? Yep.
There's a lot of information on the USGBC
Yep.
website.
Yep.
And it breaks it down like into categories, but I think it has like the rate per square foot, 6 to 7 cents, depending on the square footage of the building. But then it also has all the fees and the flat rates and the per building pre-certification, so just all that has to be.
See, here's the interesting thing about how LEED works. LEED is based on a series of points, okay? And it's kind of like, you've got this whole catalog, if you will, of things that you can get points for. And once you accumulate certain number of points, then you get a certain rating, okay? Now, but not all points are created equal. And this is kind of an interesting gamesmanship that goes on with the LEED certification process. you can only imagine, once again, if you're serious about getting, you know, a certain level of LEED certification, whatever it is, whether it's certified, silver, gold, or platinum, that people have taken the time to explore how much does it cost to get us this point versus this point. Like, for example, one of the points that you can get is like having bicycle racks, because that's not an energy efficiency thing, but that is a thing that is, from a sustainability perspective, we're encouraging people to bike to work, and so we're gonna have bicycle racks. And so you get a certain point value for that. And then a point value for having then the showers where they can change clothes after they've biked in to work. You know, then you get another point for that. Or you get a point for, you know, sort of energy efficient lighting, or you get a point for using renewable natural resources in terms of, you know, types of flooring or types of wall coverings or what. But my point about this is that each item has a point value attached to it, but yet this point may cost you $10,000. This point may cost you $100,000, but both are 1 point. Well, each point gets you to that next level. And so what, sadly, a lot of folks have done is they've gamed the system and they figure out what are the cheapest points to actually get us to, you know, the certain standard, and then basically play that game of, okay, and it has nothing whatsoever to do with really like the energy efficiency. It's all about getting points. Does that make sense? Okay, because you have to document each of these points and each item. Okay? All right, moving forward.
Do you think they look down on that? Like,
Well, of course they do, but it's like they've got to figure out a way that is measurable, doable, you know, documentable, you know, and they've refined it without question, you know, over time to try to maybe reduce some of that gamesmanship that goes on, but to a certain extent, you know, a lot of it is still there. Okay? And see, another aspect of it is, you know, sometimes, like with, especially with energy efficiency, at the end of the day, what should really matter is, okay, what is the true reduction in consumption relative to whatever maybe an industry norm is? But here's the thing. The industry norm changes from one year to the next. So what was energy efficient 10 years ago in terms of, let's say, an air conditioning system is not energy efficient today. So they constantly have to update what that standard is, you know, from one year to the next. So you may have had, let's say, a LEED platinum building, the highest you could possibly achieve 10 years ago, and that might actually be the equivalent of a LEED silver today.
You have to recertify?
No.
Okay, that's good.
So you basically get locked in, but they're very,
And inspections.
well, no, what they do is when they give you the plaque, it says LEED gold, and it's what you put up on the wall, but it says 2001. So, you know, from the standpoint that, you know that, yeah, it was 10, 15, 20 years ago that you actually, you know, achieved that. So, yeah, it's not necessarily current with respect to what the current standards are. But you can still claim it was LEED gold or whatever as of 2001 or whatever the year was. Okay? All right. So, once again, this last one, government incentives for energy efficiency. What kind of things did you find there?
I found a bunch of like weird little ones for at the state level.
Yep.
Like Arizona will pay for up to $500 if you convert your fireplace to a wood burning stove, just because it saves wood and trees, I guess. But from the federal level, there's a thing called a solar tax credit,
Yep.
which basically allows you to deduct 30% of the installation costs that comes with installing solar
Yeah,
panels.
and in some locations, they can marry that federal incentive with a state or local incentive to where you potentially can get solar panels on your home at no cost to you. okay? And in actuality, not only would it not be of any cost to you, but at some point, if it generates excess capacity, you may be able to sell that excess capacity back to the grid.
Really?
Yeah.
They're doing that now.
Yeah, no, they are, yes.
Doing that.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
So, okay, any other examples though of local? Or no, was, okay.
Or
Government
just
incentives.
on, structurally, you can get expedited review of permitting processes.
Okay.
Higher density and height bonuses.
Yeah, I mean, so that's an interesting, especially from a developer's perspective, all right? That if you do certain things to make your building more energy efficient, whatever it might be, we're gonna allow you to have higher density as a local government on this particular parcel of land. Well, that's obviously a significant incentive. If we can build, let's say, one extra apartment unit per acre, or 2 extra units per acre, that is significant to us in the sense that that's going to generate more revenue for us, so we're going to be thrilled about that. Okay? And also, as you were saying, also height restrictions, which also kind of leads into, I mean, this is all very much of a land use planning / land use regulation kind of issue, but it leads into, I think, a much broader discussion, which I think is kind of fascinating, and that is, to a certain extent, the arbitrary standards that local governments set in the first place as it relates to density, height restrictions, you know, parking requirements, and that sort of thing, that, you know, where do those standards come from? Well, in some cases you could argue, well, they're maybe based on historic information or best practices or whatever it is, but don't you find it interesting that they can, to a certain extent, at a whim, adjust those standards in such a way that all of a sudden, you know, we're saying that historically, you know, we would only allow buildings to be 4 stories in height within our city. But if you make it an energy efficient building, we'll allow you to do 5 stories. You know, so why can't all other buildings be 5 stories? Well, because we said so. You follow what I'm saying? And that's what's, you know, kind of sometimes a bit artificial about some of these kinds of incentives, is that all of a sudden you potentially lower the overall kind of thing that the average ordinary person can do, but then we sort of tack on this extra benefit for those folks that are doing the things that we want them to do, if you follow. Which gets into a whole other kind of back and forth. Like, for example, a lot of governments try to turn it into a zero-sum game. And what I mean by that is, for every person that we give an incentive to, there has to be someone else paying a penalty. You follow what I'm saying? So for example, let's say this half of the room over here, which is obviously less than this half in terms of number of people, but we're going to give every single one of you an incentive, you know, to build your energy efficient building, and you know, we're going to reward you for that, okay, by, you know, several hundred thousands of dollars, okay, but we're going to fund that by saying, you guys over here are building crappy ordinary buildings, and so we're going to charge you a penalty for basically of $100,000 per building for building below the standard that we want you to build, and then we're going to take all that money we've generated from those fines or from those fees, and we're going to award that to these guys. Okay, does that make sense? And that happens quite often because it's kind of, once again, it's kind of the carrot and the stick thing. But once again, you guys are all getting the stick, you know, and you guys are all getting the carrot, you know, over here. Yep.
I was just gonna say they did that kind of with the new AC systems have new gas. So they tax the old gas at a much higher rate, making it almost unaffordable.
Yep. Okay.
179D, commercial buildings energy efficiency tax deduction. It's on energy.gov. It's just stating that if you install or update for new buildings and existing buildings, you can get a tax deduction. I haven't read the whole thing, but tax deduction of $1.80 per square foot is available to owners of new existing buildings to install interior lighting, building envelope, heating, cooling, ventilation, or hot water systems that reduce energy by 50%.
And so that's, once again, just it feeds into the narrative of what I've been saying, is that yes, there are incentives out there. It's a question of whether you take advantage of them or not. as a developer, but the awareness hopefully is being created that you need to be looking around for these sorts of things, because they could make the difference in some instances of the building being profitable or not being profitable, or being more attractive to a prospective tenant by having these features put into place than not having them put into place. So these are things to certainly consider. Okay. So one example that I was hit with several years ago that I thought it's a fascinating story, and it was one of my first I guess, exposure to this kind of set of issues. We were taking a group of students to Australia for a sustainable sort of development study tour several years ago. And we were visiting a variety of different sort of resorts and different government facilities that had all put into place these different standards and a lot of sort of cutting edge technology and that sort of thing. And so one of the properties that we visited, it was this 5-star eco resort, okay? Well, I'm sorry?
Australia?
Yeah, in Australia, in Brisbane specifically. And so we go to this resort, and it's like the most amazing place that you've ever been. I mean, just absolutely gorgeous, surroundings and, very, very tropical. But it's on this island. You gotta take a boat to get there, and you get there. And the thing that they had that was really interesting was in every single one of the rooms, they had monitoring devices for electricity consumption, for water consumption, for sewer usage, for and then for the heating, for gas. Not that you really needed the heat, but in terms of like a stove. So they had all these different monitoring devices, and you could turn on the TV in the room, and on the TV it would show what your room with your level of energy consumption in real time, how much water you were using, how much electricity you were using, and so forth, so on. And did this for, and then showed how your performance stacks up with everybody else that's in this particular resort of several hundred units, okay? Well, that was interesting. It was kind of cool. Yeah, you could see, what the consumption, like I said, what it was. So if you flick on a light, instantly you see, in essence, the meter running and can see that you're consuming this amount of electricity. But what was interesting is that they thought, okay, we want to sort of almost make a game out of this. And so they would tell you the moment you checked in, if you have the lowest amount of consumption, you get a free room. Now this is a place, it was like several $100s a night, so obviously everybody is going to join in to try to, win the free night. So you can imagine the behavior modification that takes place. That basically you've got people, not flushing the toilet, not showering, not turning on the lights, not using the air conditioner, just doing everything imaginable to have the lowest amount of consumption to potentially win that free night. But the fascinating part about that, beyond that behavioral change, was also how much it impacted their consumption of energy as a whole for the property. That their operating costs were radically below what you would ever expect them to be because of that sort of an environment being sort of fostered. And so I thought, wow, this is really fascinating. This is great. And so I walked away from there, saying to myself, wow, this is like the best example ever. And I'm going to come back to the story in a second. But
You trying to do that here?
no, I wouldn't visit the place again 10 years later.
Oh, okay.
And I'll tell you what happened. But before I do that, let's think about this for a second. Imagine in your own homes or in your cars, for that matter, that kind of like with the Nest thermostats and with the the different things that you have available in your car, that the moment that you turn on an appliance or the moment that you travel a certain distance or whatever, that you had actual real-time, real cost information about, every, like, if you think about your car, it's not just the cost of gasoline, it's the cost of maintenance, it's the cost of your car payment or lease payment or, whatever, insurance and so forth, so on. But I mean, imagine if you're like driving down the road and then, you're literally seeing almost like you would in a cab or Uber or whatever, that, here is my real cost, for this trip, that, all those things included, this trip is really costing me, what I'm thinking only in gasoline cost, it's really costing me so much more, and you would see that in real time. Don't you think that would modify your behavior a bit in terms of the trips? I mean, realizing that certain trips you've got to do. You've got to, mandatory trips to, work and that sort of thing. But in terms of just, for lack of a better description, joyriding around, town, taking that leisurely, whatever, Sunday afternoon drive, would you not maybe be modified to a certain extent in your behavior if you're price sensitive to that sort of stuff? Or more specifically, let's talk about like how cold or warm you potentially keep your, where you live, to what extent, if you could see in real time what your electric bill was at that moment, and then the moment you flip on the lights or the moment that you flip on the stove or the air conditioning, you could literally see in real time the numbers rolling. Would that not potentially modify your behavior? Because, I mean, I don't know about you, but whenever I was growing up, my father was one of those, turn off every light whenever you leave the room, make sure you close the door whenever you leave the house, kind of thing, and always, very conscious about that. We're not going to heat and cool the whole neighborhood kind of, aspect. And my point with that is just simply, barring having somebody, giving you mandates like that, don't you think that your behavior, to a certain extent, would be influenced if you actually saw in real time that consumption sort of information? Yes?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
to tack on to what you said, I'm kind of the same way. My father was like that, turn the lights off, this and that, so I'm very adamant about that, turn it off. But there's other members in my household who kind of didn't catch on to the lesson, so coming back to where you are, to see it in real time, because I go around and turn all the lights off behind them or all of that. Well, maybe something like you said, to see how much energy they're burning and wasting, maybe you could modify their behavior. I don't know.
And my reason for bringing this up is from a real estate perspective. Do we potentially, with that provision of additional information, is maybe what is necessary to take things to the next level, in terms of real-time consumption for office tenants, for retail tenants, for, whoever, that maybe, the average ordinary worker may not be overly concerned about that, but if basically the CEO of the company is, then to what extent, would that be enough to modify the behavior of the people that, when they leave the office on, Friday afternoon, that they turn off their computers, they, do whatever recycling that needs to be done and so forth, so on. Well, okay, so that's one thing to sort of think about. Another that I ran across, this happened to also be in Australia, and I'm going to come back to the first example here in a minute, but we went to visit this one office building that, this building had all these cutting edge technologies with respect to whenever the sun would be in a certain position in the sky, automatically the blinds in the room or in the building would come down or close or open or whatever, depending on, to basically try to reduce the heat gain, obviously in the building. You'd also have basically the air conditioning system was set up in zones so that depending on, in other words, you wouldn't necessarily uniformly have to cool or heat the whole building all at once. You would only heat and cool the zones that were currently hot or currently cold. Does that make sense? So it was a very sophisticated system that they had put into place. But they also had, some assumptions, built into the model. One of the architects designed all of this. Number one, they never thought about people working at night, okay? And so what ended up happening is you had a number of firms were in this office building that the system was set up to pretty much be kind of like a 7 o'clock in the morning until 6 o'clock at night system, and that was how it was sort of modeled from an energy, perspective. But what they found was that, you know, throughout the whole building, all the different floors, even with the zoned air conditioning, you'd have that lone worker, you know, on each floor that they would have to have air conditioning or heating on for, that would blow their budget apart because that person was working until 1 o'clock in the morning or coming in at 5 o'clock in the morning or whatever it might be. And then they had another issue that they really didn't adequately model, which I thought was interesting, was in these office buildings, they purposely were like, don't have any of your cubicles or office space closer than 10 feet to the windows. And the idea behind that was, that's where the majority of the heat is, you know, obviously within, you know, a 10-foot distance. But yet, of course, what do the occupants of the building do? Immediately jam everybody right up adjacent, you know, to the windows. And so those people were always hot. Well, then the air conditioning would be working extra hard to try to cool down, you know, those people. So even the best laid plans and intentions don't always have the consequences that you know, expect, or you have unintended consequences. And that is where it leads me to the end of the story about the other Australian property. This is another really valuable lesson. So I went back to visit this property about 10 years later, and I'm so excited to take, you know, a group of students into this property and say, you know, look at all this cutting edge, you know, I'm just like, in my mind, just, you know, I can't wait to see these systems and to see what they've done and see how much better they've made it over the past 10 years. Well, apparently about 3 years prior to my revisit, the property sold to some new owner investor. And this particular new owner investor didn't care less about any of the energy efficiency kinds of things, or, you know, these, you know, sort of monitoring devices and so forth. And so I get to the I didn't know that. And so I get to the room and I'm like, you know, turning on the TV and like, where the heck is this, you know, thing showing me all the consumption? And it's not there. So I go back to the front desk and I say, well, what's the deal? You know, I'm looking for this. And they're like, yeah, the new owners, we got rid of that because that system was incompatible with our movies on demand system. And we make more money off of the movies on demand than we made off of the cost savings on the utilities. And so it was like, really, you know? But that was their whole reason for, you know, basically getting rid of the system, is because, oh, we make more money on movies on demand, and it just happened to be an incompatible system. So, you know, it's just like, wow, you know. So it's really interesting whenever you look at these things, and, you know, you do sort of wonder, you know, from a sustainability perspective, just, you know, how long, you know, these things can be sort of expected to maintain their benefit or their usefulness or their implementation. You know, this is the thing I question constantly about a lot of these things. You know, are they kind of a flash in the pan kind of, you know, everybody's concerned about this right now, but, you know, a couple of years from now, no one really cares. You know, and so we kind of have to, you know, sort of wonder that with all this talk of sustainability and so forth, you know, is it just that? Is it a fad, or is it something that's a bit, you know, longer term in nature? But I think the one thing, at least in my own mind, you know, being the numbers guy, you know, the energy efficiency aspect, if that's a true cost savings, you would have to think that's something that people are going to continually strive to try to minimize, are the cost associated with energy consumption. And the fact that, yeah, we do have limited resources, so we probably ought to be concerned about that. Okay? Thoughts, questions, observations?
I think the problem that a lot of developers run into, that it's a function of how long you want to own the property.
And that's another, yeah, absolutely.
If you're a merchant developer, and you're just going to buy the land, build it, and sell it as soon as it's
yeah. Why do you care? Yeah,
you really don't. Yeah.
Yeah. All you're concerned about there is, okay, you know, can I basically get the property up to a certain level of occupancy, and as soon as I achieve that occupancy level, boom, time to put that property up for sale and wash your hands of it and move on to the next one.
Would you sell at a lower cap or like an energy efficiency?
The idea would be yes. I mean, you know, theoretically, yes, you should sell at a lower cap because it's supposedly lower risk because, once again, you have lower operating cost and hopefully a longer sustainable value.
So as that merchant developer, would it make sense then in that case? Like with the
well, it would if, once again, you can show and reflect that that savings. And because at the end of the day, let's try this thing off. At the end of the day, all of this still boils down to our good friend curve. Okay? For every additional dollar of net operating income that we can generate due to energy cost savings, that's going to have an impact on the underlying value of the property. So that, if we can generate, $1 of additional income, net operating income, and we have a 10% cap rate, then that's basically saying we have added an extra $10 to the underlying value of the property. So, as it was shown on that one slide where it was saying, okay, your original NOI was this, your revised NOI is that, well, that is what's going to translate into, that value creation. And so the whole thing of another way to flip it around is that you could also sort of say, well, if I had to spend $10 to put that feature into place, and I have this requirement of a 10% cap rate or rate of return, it better well flow through and give me that extra dollar of income. Now, what you would hope is it actually maybe generates $2 or $3 of income, okay, relative to what we've got going on here. But at least at a minimum, it's going to have that incremental sort of revenue generation that makes it worthwhile. All right. Anybody else? Thoughts, questions, observations? Okay, let's do a little quiz. Forgot about that, didn't you? Okay.